بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back to everyone to lecture 9. Inshallah, we're going to read the tafsir of Ibn Kathir of Surah Abasa and the third surah in Juz Amma. Now, right off the bat, we're going to have a big problem because we will narrate what probably for many of you you will think is the standard background to the story, and many of you probably it has been presented to you that this is an example of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonishing the Prophet alayhi for frowning in the blind man's face because he was talking to somebody important from Quraysh. And that's basically, when you read the narrations that Ibn Kathir puts together, that's basically what he's also saying. However, I want to point out to you that this is one of those moments where this is an incorrect interpretation. And I will read to you a couple of passages specifically on this point from the Shifa of Qadi Ayad radiallahu anhu. I'm sure there are other people who've dealt with it, but as I was preparing, I know that for sure Qadi Ayad has that, so I just pulled up the book and got the page number for it to show you that sometimes Mufassir's approach can lead to blind spots, or in a Mufassir's approach there are blind spots. So no one is denying the narrations that Ibn Kathir is putting together. I mean, I'm not at the level that I can do that, but there's something off, that the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't pay attention to the blind man and frowned in his face. That doesn't really make sense with what we know about the Prophet ﷺ. So this is a problem that I want to present. I'm glad that we're having it. How then can you reconcile all these things? Because obviously Ibn Kathir is not speaking from himself. He's bringing all these narrations. So we want to look at that. And then I want you to see how we deal with it. There are multiple ways of dealing with it. Not just one way, but there are multiple ways of dealing with it. Even though we'll go through most of the surah, this really is the heart of today's lecture. I want you to see how you deal with something like this, and how we don't have to attack each other, but we have to also be brave to say when things just don't make sense at a fundamental level. Anyway, we'll begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so let me read the first couple verses of the surah and then the translation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Abasa wa tawalla. In the name of Allah, the most merciful commander. He frowned and turned away to others. And ja'ahu al-a'ma, that the blind man came to talk with him, so he spoke to them. وَمَا يُدْرِيكَ لَعَلَّهُ يَزَّكَّى. Verse number 3. While how should you know? Happily he might grow pure in word and deed. 4. أَوْ يَذَكَّرُ فَتَنْفَعُ الذِّكْرَى, or at least remember and heed, and the remindance do him good. The remindance, I've never seen that word like that. The remindance do him good. I thought it would be a reminder, but okay, I'm not here to critique that right now. So he begins, Ibn Kathir rahimahullah wa nafa'na bi'ulumi fi darain amin. He says, ذكر غير واحد من المفسرين أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم كان يوما يخاطب بعض عظماء قريش وقد طمع في إسلامه. So he said more than one of the scholars of tafsir mentioned that the Rasulullah صلى الله عليه وسلم one day was speaking with عظماء قريش, the leaders of Quraysh, and he was hopeful. طمع, the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم was hopeful that they would convert. فبينما هو يخاطبه ويناجيه إذ أقبل ابن مكتوم رضي الله عنه وكان ممن أسلم قديما. And then while the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to these leaders of Quraysh, Ibn Maktoum رضي الله عنه, who was the blind Sahabi, one of the great Sahabi رضي الله عنه, he came to the Prophet ﷺ in the middle of this interaction between the Prophet ﷺ and the Ulama Quraysh, and he was Ibn Maktoum was from those who had converted a long time ago. فجعل يسأل الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم عن شيء ويلح عليه. So he kept asking the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم ويلح عليه, and he kept insisting on his asking about the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. So I'm just going to maybe stop the Arabic and go to the translation. So the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم wished that he would stop for a moment so that he can continue talking to these important people. because he was, hoping that he would be able to guide them. And then Ibn Kathir says, وَعَبَسَ فِي وَجْهِهِ في وجه ابن مكتوم وأعرض عنه وأقبل على الآخر. So the Prophet frowned in Ibn Maktum's face, turned away from him, and started talking to the people of Quraysh. And then Allah Ta'ala revealed the verses عَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى أَنْ جَاءَهُ الْأَعْمَى وَمَا يُدْرِيكَ لَعَلَّهُ يَزَّكَّى. وَمَا يُدْرِيكَ لَعَلَّهُ يَزَّكَّى, verse number 3. While how should you know? Happily he might grow pure in word and deed. Okay. So the tafsir continues that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the Prophet ﷺ not to do that, and that he should treat people equally. This is all from Ibn Kathir's words, there's no narration so far. That he should treat those that are high or low in society equally. The rich, the poor, the free, the slave, men and women, old and young, etc. And then Ibn Kathir says, and then furthermore, Allah Ta'ala is the one who guides people to the straight path. Okay, now we get to the narrations. Al-Hafidh Abu Ya'la says in his Musnad that we were informed by Muhammad ibn Mahdi, who were informed by Abdul Razzaq, we were informed by Muhammad on the authority of Qatada, on the authority of Anas radiallahu anhu, in the tafsir of Abasa wa Tawalla, and then this is the narration, that Ibn Maktum came to the Prophet ﷺ when he was talking to Ubay ibn Khalaf, فَأَعْرَضَ عَنْهُ, so he turned away from Ibn Maktum, and then Allah Ta'ala revealed Abasa wa Tawalla. So therefore, after this, the revelation, the Prophet ﷺ used to honor him. Let me just read to you these narrations, and then we'll get to the meaty stuff. Qatada narrates that Anas ibn Malik says, I saw on the battle of Al-Qadisiyah, this is after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ to Rafiq al-A'la, I saw on the battle of Qadisiyah that Ibn Maktum had a shield and had a black flag, meaning that he was a leader and he was honored. And then Abu Ya'la and Ibn Jarir say, we were informed by Sa'id ibn Yahya al-Amawi, we were informed by Ubay, who said about Ibn Maktum, tracing the train back, it keeps going to Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, who said, Sayyidah Aisha says that Allah Ta'ala revealed Abasa wa Tawalla in Ibn Maktum, the blind one. He came to the Prophet ﷺ, so he kept asking him to guide him. And with the Prophet ﷺ, or in the Prophet ﷺ's presence, was a man from Ulama al-Mushrikeen, one of the important people of the disbelievers. So the Prophet ﷺ moved away from Ibn Maktum to talk to the disbeliever. So the Prophet ﷺ kept telling the disbeliever, are you seeing anything wrong with what I'm saying? And the man said no. And then Abasa wa Tawalla was revealed. So Ibn Kathir says that Tirmidhi narrates this hadith on the authority of Sa'id ibn Yahya al-Amawi in a similar chain of transmission. Okay, and then likewise it's also found in the Muwatta. More narrations. Also it is narrated by Ibn Jarir and Ibn Abi Hatim from the path of Al-Awfi on the authority of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma about Abasa wa Tawalla and Jahu al-A'ma, saying while the Prophet ﷺ was talking to Utbah ibn Rabi'ah and Abu Jahl and Abu Jahl ibn Hisham and Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, and he was speaking to them frequently, hoping that they will convert. So a blind man, meaning Ibn Maktum, came to him. His full name is Abdullah ibn Maktum, who kept coming to talk to the Prophet ﷺ while he was doing this. Asking the Prophet ﷺ to teach him from the Quran. So the Prophet ﷺ moved away from him and frowned in his face and turned away from him and didn't like what he was saying and continued to talk to the disbeliever. And then this is when the verses were revealed. So hopefully you can see as I'm reading these narrations, kind of one would want to scratch their head like, did the Prophet ﷺ really do this? Let me just see if there's more narrations. I mean, they're all the same thing. I want to see if I want to say anything else. Okay, yeah, those are the main verses. Okay, so the rest of the tafsir, where I just left off, is just explaining the rest of the verses. We'll come back to that. But one of the issues that we have here is it leaves something to be desired vis-a-vis what we know about the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So the story, first of all, the traditional way that you will find in a lot of tafsir. First of all, what you need to understand. So I keep stumbling, but many of the tafsirs cut and paste from each other. So unless you go to an early mufassir, Ibn Kathir and Al-Razi are not early. You'd have to go to an earlier authority, which is maybe where you'll find original writing. The later people, the people that I'm selecting for you, and then in the next two lectures I'll select something even later than that for reasons I'll let you know. A lot of it is just, okay, I'll take this couple pages from here, these are the narrations and it's already been done before, I don't have to redo it. But the problem is that when you do that, oftentimes you don't pause to consider, are there any blind spots? Is there anything that's missing? Is there anything that needs to be commented on? This is one of those things. There's a modern relatively in like the last 100 years approach in tafsir called bid'atu tafsir, the innovations or the negative and false innovations that we have in the genre of tafsirs, where the muhaqqiqun, those that seek to verify certain issues, will go back and pick up issues like this to try to deal with them. I'll pick up this discussion in the next clip, inshallah. So, sometimes when you narrate things the way that Ibn Kathir does, one of the blind spots is you're not considering, is there another angle? Because if you read, and I'm not saying that Ibn Kathir is saying this, but if you read what we just read a couple of times, it is very easy for you to conclude two things. That one, the Prophet ﷺ did something wrong. And number two, specifically, that's the general thing, specifically the Prophet ﷺ frowned in a blind man's face and was annoyed by him. And it's people that just inherit that tafsir will go around saying, even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admonished the Prophet ﷺ. So, فَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. So remind people, the reminding benefits people. And we kind of just inherit that, we just kind of repeat that. But that's a huge problem to say the Prophet ﷺ made a mistake. When we say he's ma'soom, he's infallible, which is why somebody like Qadi Ayad wrote, the Shifa. The whole point of the book of the Shifa is to explain to us, amongst the things, is that's an impossibility. It's impossible that the Prophet ﷺ would do something like that. They would do something wrong. All of the Anbiya. The Prophet ﷺ was born al-Insanul Kamil. He was born as a complete person. And when he received his revelation, he became al-Insanul Rabbani. Then he became, a person that was inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that conclusion of those narrations, even though I can understand why somebody would conclude that, that's completely wrong. There's no room for that. It's a completely false interpretation. So then we come back to, first of all, I need you to understand that. I need you to understand that there are first principles that we have. If we do something in the tafsirs that violates the first principle, then there's something something is wrong. So the first thing is to understand that these things do happen because the tafsir are so rich and so wide and there's so many details in it that it's impossible for each single mufassir to spend so much time like we are right now in each little detail. And sometimes they just will, okay, Ibn Kathir's protocol is like, I'm just going to put all the sound traditions that I find sound about this tafsir. And if I do that, I'm good. I go on to the next verse or the next chunk of verses. So in that, you can see that there are going to be problems. And that's why it's very important to go back to the very beginning of this class when we did the principles of tafsir from Sheikh Osama's book. It's very important that you understand that each mufassir has an approach, a methodology of tafsir. Oftentimes that will be laid out in the introduction, which I mean I didn't spend much time doing because the class is focused on Juz' Amma, but I'm kind of giving it to you as we go along. And in that, you have to also admit that there are going to be blind spots. So Ibn Kathir, is one of his blind spots is, not using reasoning and argumentation to argue about the validity of a point or not. Whereas you can say the opposite is one of the blind spots of Al-Razi. He doesn't spend so much time on the verification of traditions, and therefore it would be easy for other weaker traditions to appear, as you would find in some of the At-Tabari or some of the other tafasir. That's okay. I mean, al-kamal lillah, as we say, perfection belongs to Allah Ta'ala alone. So it's okay that there are blind spots, but we need to be aware that when we're reading a tafsir, there are blind spots. When I come to share with you the tafsir of Ibn Ajiba, which is a Sufi tafsir, a late Sufi tafsir, you will see that there are a lot of blind spots because there's a lot of the tafsir, what we're used to tafsir, not even mentioned. It's just kind of the ishara, the things that are indicated by the verses, which is very beneficial because those things are not talked about in Al-Razi and Ibn Kathir, for example. But it's also a blind spot because it's not complete. So if you're a student of knowledge and you become an imam and a sheikh, a mufti, a teacher, etc., you're going to have at least, I would say, a half dozen tafsirs at your disposal because you're going to have to look up here and there. Okay, so that happens. So the second problem we have is that, well, we have all these narrations. Now I can't say that these narrations are wrong or false. So how do we deal with them? So I think that one of the best people that deals with them is Qadi Iyad radiallahu anhu, who died in the year 544. So, this is 2 centuries prior, and for Ibn Kathir. So he says, radiallahu anhu, وَأَمَّا قَوْلُهُ عَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى أَنْ جَاءَهُ الْأَعْمَى. As for Allah Ta'ala's saying, عَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى أَنْ جَاءَهُ الْأَعْمَى. And this, by the way, is in the chapter of في الرد على من أجاز عليهم الصغائر والكلام على ما احتجوا به في ذلك. This is a section on those who say that small sins are permissible for the prophets, plural, alayhim as-salam, and responding to the things that they adduce to prove that. So this is one of those issues. So he says, radiallahu anhu, فَلَيْسَ فِيهِ إِثْبَاتُ ذَنْبٍ لَهُ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. So in these 2 verses, there is no establishment that the Prophet ﷺ committed a sin. بَلْ إِعْلَامُ اللَّهِ. Rather, it is a statement by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah ta'ala is not saying, Ya ayyuhan nabi, O you Prophet, you have committed a sin. He is narrating, Allah ta'ala is narrating for us a story. عَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى أَنْ جَاءَهُ الْأَعْمَى. That he frowned and turned away to others, that the blind man came to talk with him as he spoke to them. بل إعلام الله عز وجل أن ذلك المتصدى له ممن لا يتزكى وأن صواب الأولى كان لو كشف لك حال الرجلين الإقبال على الأعمى. So Allah Ta'ala is informing the Prophet ﷺ through this narration that you think you're going to help this guy. This guy is helpless, meaning the Quraysh. This is where the better conversation is. And then he says, قاضي عياض وفعل النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم لما فعل وتصديه لذلك الكافر كان طاعة لله وتبليغا عنه واستئلافا له كما شرعه الله له لا معصية ولا مخالفة له. He says, furthermore, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ was talking to the person of Quraysh was ta'ah, was an act of worship, obedience that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded him to do that. وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. He does not speak from his own self. So the Prophet ﷺ speaking to the Qurayshi is because he was commanded to do that. So there is no sin in what Allah ta'ala orders him to do. And then he says, I'll skip the next paragraph, it's just a little bit of the same thing. And then he says, وَقِيلَ, another interpretation by Abu Tammam, but unfortunately in my version there is no reference, and I didn't have time to check it up. And this is something that's very important. I mean, we'll probably spend the rest of the lecture on this one. وَقِيلَ أَرَادَ بِعَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى الْكَافِرِ الَّذِي كَانَ مَعَ النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم قاله أبو تمام. So Abu Tammam says, in another interpretation, that the pronoun, the damir and the verses, abasa wa tawalla, who was the one that frowned? Because if you read the verse, it doesn't say that the Prophet ﷺ frowned. And if you read most of the traditions that we read, it just repeats what was said in the verse. So Abu Tammam, and there are other more of the later ulama, the teachers of my teachers, like that generation, late 19th century, early 20th century, well, 2 generations prior, I guess, they would say that the verse is referring to the disbeliever, that the disbeliever is the one that frowned when Ibn Maktoum came to talk to the Prophet ﷺ, not that the Prophet ﷺ frowned in his face. Now that's also an acceptable interpretation given the sequence of the verses and how the pronouns and all of that work from a linguistic point of view. So this is an attempt, these are 2 attempts, right? In what Qadi Ayad said, these are 2 attempts to interpret the story. There is no denying the traditions that this is a sequence of verses revealed for Ibn Maktoum radiallahu anhu. There is no denying the story that the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to the people of Quraysh, important people of the Quraysh, and then Ibn Maktoum comes to talk to the Prophet ﷺ. There is no denying that there is frowning and so on and so forth. But what are the exact meaning of that vis-a-vis the parameters of what we know about the Prophet ﷺ? It's impossible for us to say and conclude that the Prophet ﷺ did a sin. And in the same section in Qadi Ayad's book, he'll say the same thing about, the verses of Adam alayhi salam eating from the tree and so on and so forth. I mean, it's not a class on that, so I don't want to digress too much. But therefore, because we have a parameter of what we believe, that can't be a correct interpretation. So therefore, we have to make sense of the narrations. We have to make sense. So we remind ourselves, as Qadi Ayad is radiallahu anhu, well, the Prophet ﷺ is not doing something from his nafs, because all of that, the Prophet ﷺ hoped that they would believe, that's from Ibn Kathir, that's not from the narration. That's not from the narration that we have. So therefore, we can drop that part and we can say, well, wasn't he speaking because Allah Ta'ala told him to speak? I'll pick this up in the next clip, inshallah. So, when you read the tafsir, let me just back up a couple steps. It's very important, like Ibn Kathir, for example, what we're doing now. It's very important for us to say, is this something that Ibn Kathir himself is saying, or is this something that he's narrating? If it's something that he's narrating, okay, well, I got to weigh the narration, and we have to look at the books of hadith and jarh and ta'dil and all of that. Maybe there's some wiggle room if we say, well, there's a weak narration or there's another narration. But if it's Ibn Kathir saying it and he's from the Khalaf, he's from the later people, I mean, we don't have to accept it at all. I mean, he could say something completely ridiculous. And, ulama say ridiculous things all the time. It doesn't negate their scholarship, but, only Allah Ta'ala is perfect. So that part about the Prophet wanted him to, was hoping and desiring, he didn't want to be, that's the part of the mufassir making sense of the narration and the verses. But you say to yourself, well, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't speaking to the man because he was, hoping that he was going to convert, because the Prophet ﷺ was ordered to do that. Well, when you come to think about it, the Prophet ﷺ was ordered to do everything that he does. And wait, didn't Allah Ta'ala tell us that the Prophet ﷺ doesn't speak from his own self, but he speaks from Allah Ta'ala's command and revelation? So then you remind yourself of those parameters. Well, yeah, okay, so that's not a very accurate, or to be quite honest, appropriate thing to say about the Prophet ﷺ. He was hoping this rich guy would become Muslim. No, he was speaking to him because the Prophet ﷺ was ordered to speak to him. Because those are the people, as you see from some of the narrations, that didn't become Muslim, the worst enemies. So you can almost flip that interpretation upside down and say, well, the Prophet ﷺ didn't want to naturally speak to these people, and the reason he was speaking to them, the proof that he didn't want to is that he was speaking to them is that he was ordered by Allah Ta'ala to do that. Just like when Allah Ta'ala says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَى أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَى أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah Ta'ala says fighting has been prescribed to you, but you do not like it. The natural disposition of the Prophet ﷺ is he didn't want to fight. He didn't want to wage jihad. But it came through revelations. Maybe you like something and maybe you dislike something and it's good for you. Maybe you like something and it's bad for you. And Allah knows in Surah Al-Baqarah. So when you kind of step back, and again, something like the Shifa is very important that we have a book like this. When you step back and you kind of see the parameters, you say, okay, well, there's no way any mufassir who says that the Prophet ﷺ committed a sin in this verse or any other, that's wrong. Automatically, that's a red flag. That's not the tafsir. There's got to be another way of looking at it. So I like that second way, even though he says waqila, that it's said, meaning it's a weaker position. The verses allow you to read that in it, that it's the disbeliever that frowned because I don't want to deal with this riffraff. And that's kind of the disposition of people that are like in power and wealthy and so on and so forth. Furthermore, I think we read maybe 4 or 5 narrations. Most of the narrations simply repeat what happened in the verse, and you also don't know from the narration who is being referenced, who is the one that frowned. So that's important. That's very important, inshallah, for us to point out. Okay, I think I've overdone that. I want to jump, obviously I'm not going to be able to do more than that, do the whole surah, but I want to jump to something that's important. كَلَّا لَمَّا يَقْضِي مَا أَمَرَ. Which verse is this? كَلَّا لَمَّا يَقْضِي مَا أَمَرَ. Verse 23. كَلَّا لَمَّا يَقْضِي مَا أَمَرَ. By no means he has not yet even done what he bade him. And then 24, فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ إِلَى طَعَامِهِ. So let man look but to his own food. So, Ibn Kathir says that Ibn Jarir says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying the previous argument of the things that Allah ta'ala is creating. He said, well, the human being can't even do that. So what the disbeliever is arguing, the truth is opposite of that. Well, let me just back up a little bit. Verse 20. ثم السبيل يسره ثم أماته فأقبره ثم إذا شاء أنشره كلا لما يقض ما أمره. Then and greater, the one smooth way made easy for him, then and yet greater shall make him die, and a grave endow him. Then finally and even greater, when he wills, raise him forth alive again. And then verse 23, by no means he has not yet even done what he bade him. So, in the tafsir, Ibn Kathir says, I didn't really find many traditions about this sequence of verses. And then he says, وَالَّذِي يَقَعَ لِي فِي مَعْنَى ذَلِكَ. And what I find is the meaning of this, Wallahu a'lam, Allah knows best, that the meaning of ثُمَّ إِذَا شَاءَ أَنْشَرَ كَلَّا لَمَّا يَقَضِي مَا أَمَرَ. So 22 and 23, then finally and even greater when Allah Ta'ala wills, raise him forth alive again. And then verse 23, by no means he has not yet even done what Allah Ta'ala bade him. That he did not do what he was supposed to do in this world until his lifespan ended. And then he brings another narration about something completely different. On the authority of Ibn Abi Hatim, on the authority of Wahb ibn Manbah, saying, Uzair alayhi salam said that the angel of death came to me. Uzair alayhi salam says that the angel of death came to me and said that the grave is the heart of the earth, and the earth is the heart of creation. So if Allah Ta'ala creates what He wills to create, until they die, and then they will be buried. So the reason I mentioned it's a little obtuse. It made more sense in my mind before I prepared. But what Ibn Kathir is saying is that in commenting on verse 22 and 23, this is a rare point or a rare time when Ibn Kathir doesn't necessarily find a whole lot of narrations about the verses, which shows us, number one, this is his methodology. He is very, very concerned with, I'm going to bring the narrations. And then when he doesn't, he's a little, well, he'll say, I think this is what it means, Allahu A'lam, but still, even then, he tries to find something that's kind of related to support his opinion. So he's not really trying to approach the tafsir with any opinion. He's simply trying to buttress all of the arguments that he has with a narration. And, that's been consistent. I think we would say that that's been consistent with all of how we've approached the tafsir thus far, the last two classes and this class in talking about Ibn Kathir. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to go much further because we spend so much time on the Abasa wa Tawalla. But this is an important class for you to see that it's okay to have disagreements with respect, and it's okay that we search how to reconcile the disagreements. So our way as Sunni Muslims is to reconcile the disagreements and the differences, not to say, oh, this is just throw it away. We're not like that. Like, oh, that's odd. That doesn't make sense because we have an outer parameter. So therefore, what does it really mean? Or is there another interpretation? Or is there another way of looking at it? And then we can put those things together and almost kind of defending him, saying, well, he didn't actually explicitly necessarily say that, but it's very easy to conclude that from him. So, that's an important lesson that you're going to come across. This was not planned, by the way. I totally forgot about this discussion when we began. I wasn't thinking that we were going to talk about this, but subhanAllah, it happened, and I'm really happy that we had the opportunity to spend the class on that. We'll put a pin in it here. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Alhamdulillah, in today's class, we looked at Ibn Kathir's discussion of Surah Abasa, the third surah in Juz' Amma, and we didn't really get that far because we spent pretty much the whole class talking about the background, the first two verses, and how Ibn Kathir narrates these traditions and kind of almost leads you to conclude that the Prophet ﷺ did something wrong, hasha, and Allah Ta'ala is admonishing him for that. And we pointed out that that is not a correct conclusion at all, because the prophets, plural, alayhim salam, are infallible, and therefore it is impossible that the prophets would commit a sin, small or large. So therefore, there must be another type of understanding. And to aid us in that, we dipped into the Shifa of Qadi Iyad radiallahu anhu, specifically talking about the first two verses of Surah Al-Abasa to show us that, this was a command by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah ta'ala is not saying the Prophet ﷺ did something wrong, simply informing him that don't worry about this Quraishi guy, he's almost hopeless, but this guy is a Muslim, and so on and so forth. And then there's another tafsir that the person that frowned was the disbeliever, not the Prophet ﷺ, and that's the interpretation that I prefer, so on and so forth. So the class was really just about dealing with a sticky issue like that, and being able to be brave enough to say, okay, there's certainly something wrong on a macro level with this interpretation. I'm not denying the narrations, but there's got to be another interpretation. And lo and behold, we were able to find that. And then at the very end, I just kind of went to the verse, I think it was 22 and 23, to show us that Ibn Kathir said that he didn't necessarily have much by way of narration on those verses, but sought to offer his basic understanding. And even then, he tried to find a tradition about something kind of semi-unrelated to buttress what he was saying. And that indicates his methodologies, shows us how he's going about the tafsir and how he's sticking very much to the ma'thur, to that which has been narrated. Okay, today, lecture 9 ends our journey with Ibn Kathir. Inshallah, the next 3 lectures I'll pick another mufassir, and we'll do the same thing for 3 lessons, and then the final 3 lessons we'll do the same thing until we conclude this class. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira.